is going to fashion the universe.
In radioactive dating?
There's really two questions here, and I've got to deal with them independently. The first one is carbon dating, what's called carbon dating, and the second one is radioactive dating in general. Let me deal with them separately. Carbon dating first. Carbon dating is a process where a living organism absorbs from the atmosphere carbon with radioactivity in it. That carbon-14, that the living organism, it absorbs it as long as it lives. When it dies, it stops absorbing it. When a living thing dies, it stops absorbing anything. And then the radioactive carbon begins to decay. The concept is that if you know the rate of decay, and that's fairly constant, you can measure the amount of carbon in the thing and extrapolate backwards and say how old that creature, that tissue, that bone was related to how much carbon is left. That's a fairly good method. Radiocarbon is a method that probably works fairly well. There are two things wrong with it from a creationist viewpoint. The first one is the assumption that the radiocarbon in the atmosphere has always been the same. As a creationist, I'll say that assumption is invalid. The pre-flood Earth atmosphere was so different than the present atmosphere that that assumption is invalid. The second problem is, for evolution, that method never helps. Two reasons. Number one, its maximum is about 50,000 years. It can't go back millions and billions of years. And the second thing is, you must have tissue. You've got to have bone or living tissue. Fossils are not tissue. Fossils are stone pictures of bones. They're not the bones. The bones are long gone. The fossils are stone pictures of bones. So you can't use radiocarbon on any of the fossils. You can only use it on stuff that was alive and is now dead, and it doesn't measure long enough. So radiocarbon doesn't ever help evolution. So when you see in the press that radiocarbon proves evolution, that's sheer nonsense. The method is not good enough. The method presumes an atmosphere that's always been the same. Radioactive methods in general, I've got to talk about those. There are methods like the deterioration of uranium, from uranium-238 to lead-206, for example, and that's a process where there's radioactive decay, and if you looked at what's called a half-life process, the whole process would take 2.6 billion years if the process happened. Now, when they look at rocks, they look at rocks that were liquid and turned solid, and that's what they're measuring, the time that that rock went from liquid to solid. So what that tells you first is that the only rocks you can measure with radioactive methods are the rocks that flowed from volcanoes. You can never measure rocks that contain fossils. Let me say that again. You can never measure rocks that contain fossils. Fossil rocks are sedimentary. They're laid down in layers by water processes. You can't measure those with radioactive methods. So what they do is they take a lava flow that's near a fossil, they measure the lava flow, and then they say, well, that's how old the rock is. How do you know that? How do you know the lava flowed at that time? You don't. Steve Austin did some really great work in Grand Canyon. He took the lava flow at the bottom of the canyon, and there's a lava flow at the very top of Grand Canyon. Actually, the Indians probably saw it flow. And they measured by the radiocarbon, by the radioactive methods, the lava flow at the bottom of the canyon, the lava flow at the top. Now, you know anything about Grand Canyon? Grand Canyon's got layers that cover a large range of geological time, hundreds and hundreds of millions of years according to the geological time scale based on evolution. So we said, well, this should really help us. So we measure the bottom one, measure the top one. There was 300 million years difference. Ah, great for evolution, but it was backwards. The oldest rocks were the lava flow on top, and the youngest rocks were the lava flow on the bottom. So either the canyon was laid down upside down, or the radioactive methods here are no good, and in fact, they appear to be no good. Let me tell you one more secret about radioactive methods. When people do radioactive methods, they send the rocks to a laboratory. You say, I want some radioactive determination of how old this rock is. First thing the laboratory says is, what age do you expect? And then they try to shoot for it. There are hundreds of documented cases where the radioactive method contradicted with the evolutionary sequence. Guess what they did? They threw out the radioactive method because they know evolution happened. That's how the geological column is created. You start with evolution, and then you stack up the rocks according to the evolutionary process. You put the sea bottom rocks on the bottom because the sea bottom is where evolution is supposed to have begun. I would say very simply the sea bottom is where the first fossils were laid down, because in the process of the flood, that's the first place that got buried. The sea bottom, then the fish, then the lowland creatures, then the highland creatures. That's the sequence of burial, not the sequence of creatures coming into existence.